and we have a market garden there where we grow veg, fruit and flowers. I also teach and for ABBA Uni, and I'm a tutor mentor for the Pathways to Farming project, which is based at CAT in Machynlleth and Cultivate in Newtown, and that's training new commercial horticultural growers. So today's lesson, I was asked to put something together about rotation of vegetables and planning your plot. So I've got a PowerPoint that I'm going to share with you. Which I'll do now. And I'm going to talk through the PowerPoint, which could be about 50 minutes to an hour. And you can write in the chat at any point. And maybe Ali, are you going to be reading the chat?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so if I see something in the chat while I'm talking, I'll try and pick up on it. Otherwise, there'll be plenty of time at the end for questions and answers. So yeah, put them in the chat and we'll get to them at some point. So I'm going to share my screen now. So can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to talk about growing veg and rotation. Why is that not? There we are. So the first thing we're going to think about is, why do we want to rotate our vegetables? While I'm doing the PowerPoint, can everyone put themselves on mute so that we've got no background sound?
How do I do that?
I can try and mute all. I should be able to. I can.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
There's a little button on the bottom of your screen on the left-hand side that says mute.
Would it help to mute to the camera as well?
Yeah, but Ali will be able to mute you all. I apologise, I've got very bad internet at home, so I've driven into town. I'm sitting in the road in my car, so there is a bit of noise at the moment because people are leaving and going home from work. So there's a bit of car noise, but that should quiet it down in a bit once it goes dark.
Keep them suppressed, and currently the number of new variants that have been identified is 147.
Can we have everyone on mute?
Indeed, that's a relatively small number.
Okay, so veg rotation. We're going to look at the why. We're going to understand plant families and why that relates to rotation. And we're going to look at alternatives to rotation if you're not into rotating your veg. So the first thing is, why rotate? Is it really necessary? Well, the main reason we rotate is because we want to keep our soil healthy. And if you've got healthy soil, you've got healthy plant growth, and that's ultimately what we want. We want healthy vegetables. So we're going to think about soil health, and to start by thinking about soil health, we need to understand what soil is. So soil is nearly half the minerals that come from the rock, the base rock, and that's broken down over time and weathering to become our soil. But that's less than half of what is in our soil. The other half is air and water, and this is what a lot of people forget, that soil has to have air gaps. Without the air gaps, there's no room for roots to get in, there's no room for the water to flow through. And obviously the water table goes up and down, but this gives you an idea of quantities. And then the important bit to us is the 5%, which is organic matter. And this varies depending on how good your soil is or not. And over the last 50 years, agriculture has grown veg and grains on the same plot of land year after year after year, and not been putting back any organic matter. And so agricultural soils now are quite depleted, and some of them are down to 1% organic matter. And the problem with this is that the organic matter increases the microorganisms and soil fauna in the soil. They depend on it. And we depend on the microorganisms to be breaking down the minerals and the nutrients so that they're released so that the plants can take them up. So one of the most important things when planning your plot is thinking about where you're going to get the organic matter from. And we want to be looking at what is available locally to us. So if you live near some stables, get in contact with the stables and get some horse muck. If you live near a farm where you can get some cow muck, use that. And you should all be making your own garden compost or kitchen compost, so that you've got organic matter constantly going back in the soil. And as I said, the microorganisms are breaking down the nutrients, and plants need lots of nutrients. They need major nutrients that they use in large quantities, and they have minor nutrients that they need in much, much smaller quantities. And if you've got a healthy organic soil, the minor nutrients are generally present. But if you haven't got an organic soil, you could start to see deficiencies in the minor nutrients as well as the major nutrients. So we'll start with the major nutrients. Nitrogen being one of the main ones that all plants need in large quantities, and it's very mobile. It can be leached in with heavy rain, it can be lost into the atmosphere. So if you're applying nitrogen, you need to apply it at a time when plants are actively growing and taking that nitrogen up. And if you've got nothing in the soil, you want the soil covered so that it protects the nitrogen from being lost. And when it's leached by heavy rain, like we've got during winter, that then is washed into the rivers and causes nitrification into the rivers. And likewise, if we put big piles of muck onto the soil during the winter, that nitrogen's lost into the atmosphere. So nitrogen is for leafy growth. Phosphorus is needed for root growth. And conventionally, lots of phosphorus has been added to the ground to grow root vegetables. Traditionally, phosphorus was added when you planted a tree or shrub for good root growth. But if you've got a good organic soil, then phosphorus should be present. Potassium needed for fruit and flowers. So this is important for our tomatoes that we keep taking a crop from, and we keep expecting them to produce more fruit. So fruiting plants need them in potassium in large quantities. Then magnesium, calcium, and sulfur are all needed for cell growth and development of the plant, and the action of photosynthesis. Then we have a whole load of minor nutrients or trace elements. And the problem with not rotating is that different plant families need these minor nutrients in different quantities. So, for example, molybdenum and boron are needed in quite big quantities by the brassica family. So if you keep planting your brassicas in the same place, then they will get exhausted. So we're still thinking about soils. I'm not going to go into this in big depth because this could be a whole lesson on its own, but I just want to mention it here. When you're planning your plot, knowing your soil is the most important thing. So go out into your garden, scrape off the topsoil, any leaf litter, and then take out a scoop and look at the soil texture, see how it feels, get a feel of the particle sizes and the organic content. Now, organic matter is dark in colour, so the darker your soil, the more organic content you've got. And the best way of judging this is by comparing several soil samples. So, you know, check your veg patch with patch that's under the shrubbery or your neighbour's garden or the community garden, and then you'll get a gauge of what colour they are. The other thing that's worth doing is your pH test. It's a very simple test. You can buy one for a couple of quid. You get 2 tests in a pack. And that tells you whether you're acid, neutral or alkaline. And that will give you an indicator of what plants are going to like growing on your plot. So if you have a very alkaline soil, you will be able to grow brassicas very well. If you have a very acid soil, you'll be able to grow blueberries very well. So by knowing your pH, you can plant the things that like growing in your soil. And then finally is your soil profile. And this is just digging a big hole and looking at the strata and the layers of soil. So that way you know how much topsoil you've got. And the topsoil is the dark soil with the organic matter in, and that's where all the microorganisms are, all the earthworms, and that's the bit that's going to grow your plant. Underneath that you have subsoil, and then you have the parent rock underneath. Now, if you haven't got much topsoil, you're going to struggle to grow root vegetables like carrots and parsnips, and you might then need to consider planting raised beds, building the soil up so you've got a deeper depth. If your subsoil is thick grey clay, like mine is, you're likely to get waterlogged soil. And so you need to think about how you're going to manage that in the winter when your soil will be saturated and very wet. But like I say, this is a whole nother lesson. So that's just a very quick overview so that you're thinking about your soil. Now, one of the main reasons why we rotate, apart from keeping healthy soil, is about pests and disease, because we don't want the build-up of disease in our soils and the pests that come with those crops. So prevention is better than cure, and this is why we rotate, because once we've got a problem in the soil, we can be stuck with it for many years. So things like clubroot in brassicas live in the soil for 15 years. So once you've got it, you're really not going to get rid of it very easily, because many of our weed plants are in the brassica family. The same with onion white rot, and onion white rot is a big problem on allotments because people don't always rotate, and allotments change hands and lots of alliums get grown. And once you've got white rot, you've got it for 10 years. So again, it's hard to get rid of. So the prevention is better than dealing with it afterwards. So by rotating, you're breaking the cycle of the disease and it's not carrying on from one year to the next. So with pest and disease, we're looking at integrated pest management. And this all comes into the planning of your plot before you even start planting. So start by creating diverse systems to confuse pests, so you're not attracting them to one area. You could be choosing variety mixes of different types of carrots, for example, different cultivars. Some are more resistant to pests than others. Resistant varieties, like I mentioned, like flyaway carrot is resistant to carrot root fly, but it has less carotene, so it tastes less carroty. So if you want a really tasty carrot, you might not want to plant a carrot seed, but you could mix the varieties up and have one row of each. And then there's cultural methods. So planting times to evade the pest, water and ventilation. A lot of plant diseases are caused, especially in Wales, by the amount of water and humidity that we just generally have. So you can ventilate, leave bigger spaces between your planting on your rows and not overcrowding things, and that will reduce fungal diseases. You could put up crop barriers. Things like the carrot root fly just above the ground. So if you just put a short barrier up of 30 centimeters, that stops the carrot root fly. You could put nets over your crop, and there's advantages and disadvantages of that. You know, once things are covered up, it's harder to see whether you've got slugs in there, or you might trap some butterflies in there, and then they're causing more damage than without the barrier. You can set traps, and you can think about companion planting. We'll talk about that more. And you can attract predators that are going to eat your pest. So when we think about rotation, so a family name always ends in aci. So you see all of these end in aci. And we have things like Brassicaceae, which is all the brassicas, cabbages, swedes, turnips. We have Leguminaceae, which is the beans and peas. Solanaceae, tomatoes, potatoes. Alliaceae, or alliums for short, the onions and leeks. They used to be called umbellifera because the flowers look like umbrellas. They're not now grouped as Apiaceae, and that's your carrots and parsnips. Cucurbiaceae, cucumbers, melons, marrows. Pseudomopodiaceae, that is spinach and chard. And Compositae is lettuces. So let's have a look at those now. And we can see, so what we need to do at this point when we're planning our plot is to spend some time writing down what veg it is we want to grow. Just make a big long list or a short list, whatever, and then group those vegetables into the plant families so that we can see what quantity we've got of each plant family. And what we often find is we want to grow quite a lot of onions because we're growing onions in the summer, we're growing leeks over winter, into the winter. We've got garlic that are overwintering. We might have some spring onions as well. So the alliums are in the ground throughout the year, and this is why it is one of the family groups that builds up a lot of soil diseases, because we continuously got alliums in our crop throughout the year. Another big family, the main vegetable family, is the brassicas. And a lot of people misunderstand some of these plants because brassicas is a very successful vegetable in that we can eat any part of the plant. So we eat leafy brassicas such as cabbage and spring greens and kale. We eat the flower of brassicas such as broccoli, cauliflower. And we eat the roots of brassicas such as radish, swede, and turnip and kohlrabi. Now, these root brassicas, often people group together with the roots, but we need to understand that they're in the brassica family, and so they will still carry the same pests and disease. Then we come on to oriental vegetables, and this is another one where people go wrong because a lot of the oriental vegetables are the salad that we put in our salad bags, and they're the salad that we eat over winter. Things like mustard and mizuna and mabuna, taksoi and pak choi, but they're all brassicas, and again they're affected, and they can carry on the soil diseases if you don't rotate them. So we'll come back to this picture. Oh, I'll just mention umbellifera or Apiaceae. So carrots and parsnips are root vegetables, but celery and celeriac are also in that group, and so is parsley, herb. And one thing these have got in common is that they're biennials, which means they grow in the first year, the leaves, and the leaves put the energy down to a storage root that stores the energy over winter so that it can grow back the next year and produce a flower and seed. So they're all biennials. So we'll look at each vegetable in turn in a minute, but before we get there, I'll just talk briefly about rotation. Now, people get very confused about rotation. This is just a simple four-way rotation. And I say to people, it's not really important what order you put the vegetables in. Years of experience will tell you what to do with that, because there's different reasons for following one vegetable with another. But what it boils down to in practice is what type of vegetables you're growing within that group, and is the land free, ready to put the next ones in early in spring. So potatoes, generally you put lots of muck into your potatoes, you feed it really well, and so the next crop that you follows that is using up the nutrients that are left from that muck. And generally after potatoes, the ground can be quite weed free because potatoes have a good canopy cover, they cover the soil well, and break the weed cycle. So you could follow that with, for example, brassicas, but brassicas is a big family. So, you know, your potatoes are coming out in September or October if they're main crop potatoes. And then there's nothing in the bed over winter, so you might want to cover it up to protect it. Or you might decide after your potatoes, you're going to put some alliums because you want to plant your garlic in November. The potato bed's free, so you're going to put alliums in there. So it really depends on what vegetables you're growing and what rotation you choose. So in this example, we've got potatoes in year 1. This rotates and it's following the roots. But after the potatoes, we're putting the brassicas in. After the brassicas finish, we're putting our legumes, our beans and peas. Beans and peas are good in the rotation because they're deep rooted. And so they're bringing up nutrients from low down. They don't need a very nutrient rich soil because they nitrogen, they have a symbiotic relationship going on with bacteria. They're able to make their own nitrogen. So if there isn't ample nitrogen in the soil, they make their own. And then that's available for the crop that follows, and they've broken up compaction as well. And so after the legumes in this rotation, we've got the root vegetables, which are deep rooted. They're benefiting from the fact the legumes have broken up this compacted soil. And after the roots, we go back to potatoes. But like I say, one year to the next is the same. So the amount of potatoes you grow this year will be the same next year because you're rotating them to the beds that are the same size. So let's look at the beans and peas first. Like I said, they fix their own nitrogen, and you can see the picture of the roots here with the nitrogen nodules on. It's actually the bacteria that's fixing the nitrogen on there. They're deep rooted, so they can break up that compaction. They do need organic matter in peas on the plant for weeks on end as flat pods because they haven't got enough water because they've not been irrigated, it's not rained, and they just won't swell if they haven't got the water there. So although they don't need the organic matter for the nitrogen, for the nutrients, they need it to retain the moisture and work as a sponge. So it's great to mulch them. It doesn't need to be a high nutrient mulch. A low nutrient mulch is fine, something like a wood chip, grass cuttings, something like that. And that retains the moisture in the soil. You can plant broad beans and peas over winter. So they would go in the soil in October. They grow to being short plants of about 15 centimeters, no bigger than that, or they'll get blown over in the winter. And then they overwinter. And in February, when the days start getting warmer, they start growing very quickly, and you can get an early crop in May. So you can grow them in the polytunnel like that or outside in the field. And the snow doesn't matter to them, the frost doesn't matter to them, doesn't mind them. The biggest risk to them is mice, and that's when they're seeds. Once they're plants, they're okay. You can also plant broad beans and peas early in spring, and the crop comes a couple of weeks later than the autumn sown ones. But French beans, runner beans, they need hotter climate, so they're just for growing during the summer. And in allotments, quite often you see supports for the runner beans and the climbing French beans in one place, and they're there all the time. Now, beans do not get soil-borne diseases, and so it's quite safe to do that. But by not rotating them, you're missing the benefit of having them in the rotation, the benefit of them breaking up the soil, the benefit of the nitrogen on the roots that's available for the next crop. So it's worth putting them in the rotation to aid all the other crops that follow. Solanaceae. Potatoes and tomatoes. Now, most of the Solanaceae family needs protected growing. Especially if you live in Wales, aubergine, we're growing outside. So within our rotation, potatoes are the only one of the Solanaceae family that we're growing, but for space, you might want to just grow early potatoes, which you can get in the ground as soon as you've had your last frost. If you use a little bit of protection, fleece or hoops to cover them early in the season, you can ground by July, ready to put another crop in that space. So in this case, you would group another family of plants with your Solanaceae and they rotate together. So squashes are a good one that can follow your early potatoes. You can have your squashes started early in the greenhouse, polytunnel, you have them in pots ready to go in. As soon as your potatoes come out, you put your squashes in the ground. And so that is two families in one bed in one rotation. And all of these plants are very hungry and they benefit from lots of high nutrient organic matter like farmyard manure. And the main pests and disease, P&D is pests and disease, is blight, which is a fungal disease which is triggered by high humidity, and that affects potatoes and tomatoes. But if you're growing tomatoes in protected cropping, you're in control of that environment. So you can reduce the watering, you can vent it, open doors, windows, and reduce the humidity. But outside, we can't do anything about it. So blight is something that potatoes do get affected by. And what we need to do to avoid that is choose resistant varieties or plant earlies that are out of the ground before blight affects. And blight can hit anytime from July onwards. It takes 3 days of high temperature and high humidity, and then the spores are released and affect your crop. Other diseases that affect potatoes particularly are wireworm, which affects newly cultivated ground where you've had grassland. Scab, and scab is caused by not enough calcium, which is caused by not enough organic matter and moisture in the soil. And wart disease, but that's not a major problem these days. So the next major plant family is the onion family. Again, they're hungry feeders. They need a lot of nitrogen, but it's better if they're using up that nitrogen from a previous crop, because if you put too much nitrogen on, you get very soft growth and you can get white rot, and they won't store. So you have to be careful not to overdo it. The main thing that they don't like is competition for that nutrients. So onions are very shallow rooted, and a lot of your weeds are shallow rooted, and your weeds are in the same root zone as the alliums. Grass is in the same root zone, and so they're sucking up the nutrients and moisture that the onions want. So you need to keep your allium crop weed free, so hoe regularly. You can grow it from seeds or sets. And if any seed heads develop, this is usually a sign of a shock to the plant, something like drought. It's too hot for them. They'll send up a seed head because they're trying to reproduce. So snap off the seed heads. You don't want them. You want the energy going into the bulb. So the main problem is onion fly. And that affects seeds. Sets don't seem to be affected the same. Planting time, birds will peck up the new shoots because they think they're worms poking their heads up. So sometimes it's worth putting a net over them just after planting until they've put down a good root system. And white rot I've mentioned several times. So the main way to avoid white rot is rotation and not overfeeding with nitrogen. So the carrot and parsnip family They're biennials and they like a light stone-free soil. So if you've got a new veg plot, it might take you several years to get good enough soil to be able to grow these root vegetables. You can add sand into your soil to make it freer draining. If you've got heavy clay soil like I have, I always add a bit of sand into the root rotation, and that improves the soil generally year on year. Or you can build up the soil with raised beds if you've only got shallow soil. Don't ever muck your root vegetables. They don't like muck. It will cause forking. And of course you can eat forked roots, but they're harder to clean and get the mud out of. The important thing is to sow your seeds very thinly, which is very difficult because they're small seeds. But you don't want to have to thin them out too much because you're having to throw those plants away, because if you try transplanting them again, you'll get forked roots, because when you've pulled them up or dug them up, you will have damaged the very small root tip and it will then fork. But you will always have to thin your carrots because, like I say, they're small seeds. So do it early, because they are very conscious of their neighbor and they don't get any bigger. They don't invade the space of their neighbor. So until you thin them out, they won't fill that space. So thin them out early. I usually thin my carrots 2 or 3 times during the growing season. First time just to get you know, a good planting distance, couple of centimeters between each one. The second time I thin them out, I eat all those thinnings, and you can eat the leaves as well. And then the third time I'm starting to crop them as proper baby carrots ready for sale. Hoe them regularly, keep them weed free. They don't like the competition, but thinning them out and hoeing them will both attract the carrot root fly, which is attracted by the smell. So when you're thinning or hoeing, it's worth going down to your plot and scattering something that smells very strong to mask the smell. I tend to use lemon balm. It grows very fast. I've got lots of it in the garden. I cut a bit of that, put it down by the root plot. You can put coffee grounds. You can water on garlic. Anything that just smells strong. It's important that they have regular watering. So if it is a drought period, it's worth watering them really, really well a couple of times a week so that the water penetrates deep down into the soil. You don't want a little bit at the top. That won't encourage roots to go down and find water. So you water them really well once or twice a week. If they dry out too much and they don't have water, they will, when the water does come, they'll just split because the skins have started to harden. And as I mentioned before, the main pest is carrot root fly, attracted by the smell, and the main disease that affects parsnips particularly is parsnip canker, and that looks like a rusty sort of effect of the top of the parsnips. And there you can choose canker resistant parsnips, so variety choice is important, and you can earth up the parsnips so the top is covered. So that brings us on to brassicas, and like I say, brassica is one of the main families for growing veg. We eat lots of brassicas. Brassicas generally like consolidated soil. Now that's not the same as compact soil. Nothing likes compact soil, but consolidated means that you would dig it in the autumn and let it settle, ready for planting in the spring. If you haven't got consolidated soil, if you've newly dug it and then you plant your cauliflowers and your broccoli, what happens is you get open heads. They don't form that tight head that you like in cabbage or cauliflower. They're open, and that's why you need the consolidated soil so that the roots are firm. And then the head forms a firm head. So you prepare the soil several months in advance. Again, they're a hungry crop. So in the rotation, you would be giving lots of organic matter. But they are brassicas. They're lime lovers. They like alkaline soil. So if you have a neutral to acid soil, you may need to lime your soil, and you can use wood ash or eggshells or a calcium lime to do this. And if you have a heavy wet clay soil, like many of us do in Wales, it benefits better to put the lime in the autumn. So you can prepare the soil in the autumn, add the lime then, and then the lime and calcium starts breaking down and being released, ready for the plants to be planted the following spring. But you don't add organic matter and lime at the same time. They counteract each other. Most organic matter are slightly acidic. So lots and lots of pests and disease that affect brassicas. The main one being clubroot, which is the soil-borne disease. And this is why brassicas, more than any other vegetable, is really important that you rotate it. Aphids, they do attract aphids, and aphids are always attracted to soft, sappy growth. So if you overfeed with too much nitrogen, you get soft, fast growth and you get aphids. But there's lots of things that eat aphids. Birds eat aphids, ladybirds eat aphids, hoverflies eat aphids. So if you've got a diverse system, then you should have less of a problem. Cabbage white butterfly and their caterpillars are a major problem. But again, birds eat them. We had a lovely, I grew a field of brassicas this year and expecting major caterpillar problem. And we watched the blackbirds early in the morning, spend an hour on the crop, picking all the caterpillars off. And we saw lots and lots of butterflies, but never found any caterpillars on our brassicas. So it's about getting that relationship with the other wildlife in your garden. Flea beetle, the main crop flea beetle attack are the brassica salads. All the other things, it doesn't really matter too much because you're eating the flower or what have you. But the brassica salads are low to the ground and they'll get decimated in summer. And that's just why we generally grow the brassica salads during winter. So that's things like Mizuna and rocket. We grow them in winter, or we grow them in protected cropping in the polytunnel where we can avoid the flea beetle. And the root fly, so we can put collars around the plant to avoid the root fly, or we can mulch with thick layers of organic mulch. So I'll just bring you back to this table that shows you what plants are in what family. And I've talked about rotation. Now, many of you may only have 3 veg beds. So then what you need to think about is you have written your list of what you want to grow. You think about what quantities of each you want to grow and what time of year you're growing them, and whether or not you can fit families together. So I've already mentioned if you grow early potatoes, you can follow that with your courgettes, your marrows, your squashes. If you grow overwintering peas and broad beans, you can then follow them with something in the summer. It might be that you put some dwarf French beans in after your overwintering beans, or you put a different plant family with that. One combination that I always put together is the alliums and the salads, because like I said before, you have alliums in the ground all year round. As one's coming out, another one's going in, but you don't want to grow them in the same piece of soil. So at the moment, I've got garlic in my ground that has overwintered, and the rest of that bed, I could be putting salad in later this month. I could be planting outdoor salad, protected undercover, and then I'll be cropping the salad, and then I will want to be planting my leeks in July. So the salad comes out, the leeks go in, the garlic comes out in June, July time, and the salad then goes in where the garlic is. So in 1 year, I've got alliums and salad sharing the same bed. So no one can tell you what families you're going to put together, because it really depends on what vegetables you're going to grow and on what quantities. So planning succession. We want to make the most of the space we've got. So we want to sow several times in a season. things like salad, which we eat all year round, we want to sow, you know, once a month and keep replacing it. But what happens is we sow it in spring, and then we might do a second sowing in spring, and then suddenly all the salad is coming together and we've got far too much salad, we can't eat it all. And then we get a drought, hot spell, and all the salad bolts and it all goes bitter, and then we don't have anything at all. So it's important to write yourself a timetable of when you plan to sow and when you plan to plant, to avoid this glut and lull, and so you get crops right the way through. You can extend the season by getting crops in early. So I've already mentioned overwintering peas and beans that will give you an early crop. And if you use a bit of crop protection, fleece is very affordable and will raise the temperature by 2 to 3 degrees. Or you can make small cloche tunnels out of alkathene water pipe, or just get a roll of wire and cut it into short bits, and put some plastic over to protect the crops. You can grow pots in plants and then transplant them when they're a little bit bigger. And you have to be a bit harsh, and I'm not very good at this, I'm getting better, but you have to say, well, the harvesting is dwindling. Okay, I'm getting a little bit, but not much. But if I rip the plants out now, I've got time to get another plant in, and I will get a big crop off of that later in the season. Sometimes you can underplant things. So like peas, you've had the first main crop, you've had a second crop off of it. They're still producing a few flowers and a few more peas, but you don't want to rip them out yet. But if you don't get your next crop in now, you might be planting beetroot or something in that bed. If you don't get it in now, it won't be ready by the end of the summer. So you can undersow it and put a row of beetroot in, and then just cut the peas off at ground level when you've finished harvesting them, because most seeds are going to take a couple of weeks to germinate anyway. And the other thing when you're planning your crop and planning succession is think about your soil. And I've already said about how important your soil is. It is the most important thing when we're thinking about plant health. So think about keeping your soil covered. And that's not always possible with crop plants, because we take potatoes out, you know, late in the year, and what are we going to put in after that? I've mentioned garlic, I've mentioned peas and beans, but that's only a couple of beds, and other beds might be empty. So think about fertility building crops like green manures like clover that you could put in to protect the soil over winter, or use a ground cover fabric like the woven plastic Mypex, which allows the soil to breathe, it allows rain to go through, and it keeps the soil covered and protects it from the harshness of the weather, and it stops weeds growing, so that you can peel back the cover and get an early crop in early in the season in February, when you wouldn't be able to dig the soil because it's too wet. And it takes the back-breaking job of weeding away. So intercropping. Now, I've talked about biodiverse systems that attract predators. I've talked about integrated pest management and confusing the pests and mixing up the smells of your crop. And intercropping is great, but we mustn't forget our plant families and our rotation. So it takes a little bit of planning to get the intercropping right. You need to group families together and they rotate together. So we can undersow here, we've got alliums growing with lettuce. A catch crop is a very fast growing crop that grows between slower growing crops. So things like brassicas, you can see in the bottom picture on the right, we've got some brassicas growing there. Ultimately, they're planted 45 centimeters apart. Things like purple sprouting are 60 centimeters apart. That's a big space, and they do take a little while to fill that space. So we can put a fast growing crop underneath that, something like radish in the same family as the brassicas, or we might group our salads with our brassicas, because a lot of the salads we grow might be brassica salads, like the oriental greens. But what we don't want to do is put salads in every single bed, because they're quick growing and we can mix them with our onions, we can put them with our carrots, we can put them with our brassicas. So just decide which plant family you're grouping them together with and stick with it. When we're doing fertility building and thinking about green manures are plants that are grown to benefit the soil rather than taken off as a crop. Some of those green manures are in the brassica family, things like mustard. So we also need to consider that in our rotation. And you can see here as well, we're intercropping with flowers. A lot of the flowers can be edible and we can add them into our salads. And a lot of them are strong smelling as well and can deter pests. So if we take interplanting a step further and we think about polycropping instead of monocropping. So generally veg growing is monoculture. We talk about rotation, we talk about putting everything together in the same family and rotate it as a monoculture. And in a way, we want to avoid that because we want to confuse the pests. So we can start to think about polyculture, and we can do it as square foot gardening or meter squared gardening. So we're making our beds smaller and smaller, and we're still grouping the families together, but we're rotating on a smaller scale. And it's still important to understand the plant families, because I've seen people do the square foot gardening before and think they're mixing up all the vegetables. But if you don't understand the families, you could be putting radish and next to your oriental salad, and they're all in the same family, so you're not confusing any pests with that. On an extreme version of that, we've got polycultures where we're mixing all the seeds together and scattering them, like this top picture at the left. This really does confuse the pests, and because the root zones are all at different levels, they're taking nutrient water at different levels. The downside of it is you need to start with a seed-free bed, so a clean seed bed. Otherwise, you have weeds growing in it as well, and it's then very hard to weed. When things are planted in straight lines, it's very easy and quick to hoe and get rid of the weeds. And you know anything that's not in that straight line shouldn't be there. With polycultures, it's harder to identify that. So you do need to know your plants. You need to know your vegetables as well, so that you know which ones you eat the leaves of and which ones you're leaving to flower, like beans and peas. And the biggest mistake I see with polycultures is they're oversown. And this picture is oversown, it's overcrowded. None of those plants will reach their full maturity because they're too close together, and they will bolt and go to seed. And there's already a little brassica there. You can see the yellow flowers. It's already bolted because it's in competition with all of those other plants. So I prefer polycultures that are in lines. That's just my style. I like the uniformity of lines and the organization of that. So you can see in the bottom left picture, we just have lines of different veg, and we're mixing up heights, and plants that like shade are shaded by tall plants, and we have shallow root zones and deep root zones all muddled up, and so they can live in harmony together. And this is mimicking what happens in nature. And if we take that a step further, we're looking at forest gardens. And forest gardens are mimicking the natural forest. So there's trees, and trees have a big canopy, and they have a big root system, deep root system. We have climbers, and climbers need to get to sunlight. So they use the tree as a climbing frame to climb up and reach the sunlight at the top, and then they can produce their flowers. But climbers like their roots in the shade. That's naturally where they would grow. We then have lower trees in the shrub layer that grow on the edge of the taller trees. And underneath this, we have the herbaceous layer of soft stem plants. And these generally grow in clearings where a tree has been fallen over from old age, wind or lightning, and it's left a clearing, and where the sun gets into that clearing, our herbaceous plants grow. And if you look at natural woodlands, you will see this happening. As soon as a tree falls down, suddenly a whole flush of soft stem weeds grow, like rosebay willow herb, for example. And what they're doing is they're using up the nutrients in the soil, and then they're making organic matter ready to make a seed bed for plants to follow on from that. So in a forest garden, we're mixing up the layers, we're mixing up the root system, we're putting our herbaceous sun-loving plants on the south side of trees and shrubs, we're putting our climber plants underneath trees, and our shade-loving plants underneath trees and shrubs. And what we'll find is plants like the shrub layer are getting a little bit shaded from the trees, and so they may produce more. So currant bushes, for example, and raspberries will grow in the shade of a forest garden. The production will be lower than if they're in full sun, planted out on their own. But overall, the land equivalent ratio of mixing these things together, you get a higher yield when you calculate the yield of all the crops together. So this is a different way of growing your food crops on a garden scale. And the picture here on the right at the bottom is a forest garden on a roof garden in Reading. And that's got fully grown trees, lovely bark paths, compost bays, and it's all high up on a roof garden. So I'm going to talk about companion planting now. So I've talked about polycultures and cash cropping and mixing things together. We're just going to look at that more in depth and think more about companion planting with flowers and for predatory reasons. So the advantages are that it can protect from pest and disease and environment. So shade lovers can be under taller plants, or things that don't like wind can be protected by bigger plants. And what I haven't written here is it can look absolutely beautiful as well. So aesthetics come into it. Oh, I have written it. There we go. And then the disadvantages is the competition for light and nutrients and water. But if you get it right, that isn't competition. They can work together. And another disadvantage is if you don't understand the plant families, you can be your companion plants can be carrying pests and disease. So the things we need to be thinking about is shallow roots with deep roots. So they're using up different water and nutrients. Lettuce and carrots or beetroot. Carrots and beetroot are deeper rooted, they've got tap roots, and the lettuce is very shallow rooted. Radish and cabbage work well together, turnips and nasturtiums. Tall with small shade-loving plants. So spinach likes being shaded. If it gets too much heat in the summer, they bolt, the same as lettuce. So protect them with taller plants. Planting them between beans or your climbing sweet peas, just underneath, they can benefit from the shade there. And the taller plants are protecting from the harsh sun and the drying wind. The ground cover plants like the spinach and the lettuce are protecting the taller plants. They're protecting the soil from weed growth and from water and nutrient loss. So that's a mutual benefit of both plants working together. It can be space saving as well. So you can make a frame and you can grow your tall things up and you can grow shade loving underneath. I think this picture is quite early in the season, so it might get a little bit swamped later on, but you can crop your salad regularly as baby leaves, not waiting till it gets big or completely shaded out. So we've got some friendly companions here. You can plant heavy feeders with nitrogen fixers, and a good example of that is the three sisters, that's sweet corn, squashes and legumes. And there's lots and lots of scientific studies on this showing that the land equivalent ratio of growing them together compared to the same area of land growing them separately you get higher yields. Plants are native, and here in Wales, where we have very low light levels and colder conditions, they don't thrive so well as companions. It's worth giving it a try, but we don't get the high yields you would do in hotter climates. So the main problem being sweet corn needs a good head start, and there are lots of varieties of sweet corn now that crop in a shorter season. So look out for those fast maturing sweet corns, fast growing, fast maturing. Often they're F1 varieties, because you want the sweet corn to put on fast growth and get big and tall so that it can support the climbing beans. Otherwise, the climbing beans get off to a good start and strangle your sweet corn, and then the sweet corn can't grow, it can't open up. And then your squashes grow underneath. Now, squashes have developed large leaves to capture maximum sunlight, and that's because in their native country it's much hotter than here, and it's full sunlight, but they grow under tree canopy, and that's why they develop the large leaves. But in this country, where we have low light levels and shorter days, we need them out in full sun to capture the most sunlight. And we do struggle in Wales having a long enough season without frost, especially if you live up in the hills, to be able to grow our squashes well. So Three Sisters works as long as you've got a long enough season for them to develop. Other good companions are basil and tomatoes, so both polytunnel crops, and the basil is supposed to improve the flavour of your tomatoes, not just when it's on a plate together, but by growing them together. And the smell of the basil repels flies and mosquitoes. But you do need to make sure that your basil has enough space and enough airflow, because the basil doesn't like moist, wet conditions. You'll get fungal rot in there. But it does work quite well, because as your tomatoes grow as cordons, you're removing the lower leaves, and as you're removing the lower leaves, the basil plant is getting bigger. So they do work quite well. Chamomile is supposed to be a good tonic to everything. It adds calcium, potassium, and sodium to the soil. So let it seed and be a good companion plant all around your garden. It will seed freely, and it can become a little bit invasive. So, you know, let it seed, but then also hoe it and weed it out so that you just leave enough in the places you want it, so it doesn't end up competing with your crops. Now, I've talked about variety mixes. I talked about the carrot flyaway. There's resistor fly as well. And you can sow those in rows in amongst your more prone variety. Potatoes, I would always choose potatoes that are blight resistant for my main crop. Things like Carolus, very good main crop potato, or the Sharpo varieties. They've been developed in Wales, particularly for Welsh climate. Things like Axona, very, very blight resistant, very similar potatoes, high floury, dry matter, great for baked potatoes or roasting. I think most people know about planting onions and carrots together. The carrot smell masks the onion smell, and vice versa, and they both get flies that are attracted to that crop. So by planting them together, it masks the smell. It's not a foolproof companion, because in trials it showed that to mask the smell of the carrots, you needed several times the amount of onions, and vice versa. But by growing them together, you are masking the smell a bit, you're confusing the pests a bit. So you could do one row of alliums, one row of carrots, and vice versa across the whole bed. And so then they are your two families that you're grouping together, and they rotate together every year in the same bed. Onions and brassicas are supposed to be good companions. Again, onions smell very strong and they mask the smell Or you could go for ornamental plants such as geranium that smells very strong and is good, particularly with tomatoes, peppers and cabbages. Lemon balm. I don't tend to grow these plants within the bed that I'm trying to mask. What I tend to do is harvest them and scatter the leaves and the stems around the plants whenever I'm hoeing or weeding or thinning. Marigolds. There's African marigolds and there's calendula. Both of them deter whitefly and are good companions to tomatoes and cucurbits. You can use scented aromatic oils and put them in a spray and just spray it around your plants. Or you could plant sacrificial crops. I don't really rate this myself. They say plant red currants because the birds prefer the red currants to the black currants. But I actually really like red currants, so I don't want the birds eating the red currants either. They say about planting hostas because slugs love hostas, and let them eat your hostas rather than your lettuces. But hostas are very expensive plants and they're really nice and ornamental. So why would you want the slugs eating your hostas either? So perhaps a better way is getting that integrated pest management in place. Think about the habitats that you're creating and the predators that you're attracting into your space. So for slugs, you want lots of beetles, they eat lots of slug eggs. You want hedgehogs, and hedgehogs eat slugs and beetles. So think about the habitats that you need to create for that. So flat flowers, the daisy family, calendula, poached eggplant, apiaceae, they all attract lacewings, ladybirds and hoverflies, which like that sort of helicopter landing pad, it attracts them. So plant these around your garden to attract those predators, and they all eat lots of aphids. I mentioned green manure earlier, and I'll just mention it again here. Green manure is a hard thing to get your head around when you're new to growing, but some people in this group will have more experience with growing than others. And so I've just got one slide on green manures. You can confuse pests by the colour. So I traditionally always planted my brassicas, underplanted them with clover, and the green cover land 3 plants, and if those 3 plants are brassicas, they then lay their their eggs, sorry. But if they can't differentiate it between the green, so they land on the clover, it's not a brassica, they fly off somewhere else. This does work well, but only if you've got a clean seed bed to start with and you haven't got weeds coming up in amongst the clover, and you have to grow the right clover, a low growing short clover. Some green manures fix nitrogen. So if they're in the Leguminaceae family, you can grow things like winter tares that protect the soil over winter, and they fix nitrogen, so you can dig them in before your crop in the spring, and that gives a bulky organic matter to feed the soil and releases nitrogen for the next crop. Some are very deep rooted and are nutrient accumulators, sucking them up from deep down in the soil. Things like lupins and alfalfa. And they can protect from losses. So if you've got green manures on your soil over winter, it protects from leaching and nutrient loss. The hard thing with green manures is getting the timing right. And this is exceedingly difficult here in Wales because our summer is so short. And often by the time you're getting crops out in the autumn, it's too late to sow green manures and get them well established before the winter. So you're really looking at getting your green manures sown by September if you want to overwinter them. But like I said, sometimes you can undersow. Before you've finished harvesting your crop, you could sow the seeds. And you can also plant green manures during the growing season. So if you've got a gap in one bed for a short period of time, mustard seed is very quick. You can sow it and grow it in 4 weeks, 6 weeks. You dig it in before it flowers and seeds, and it gives lots and lots of bulky organic matter to feed the soil. But again, it's a mustard, it's a brassica, so you need to think about how that fits into your rotation. But mustard can be quite good before planting potatoes because it can fumigate the soil against wireworm. So if you think wireworm is going to be a problem on your soil, you can get a very quick crop of mustard in early in the season before you plant your main crop potatoes. Another thing to think about is the seeds that you use. Again, that's another whole course all about seeds, but open pollinated seeds are what happens in nature, and you get a small variation in amongst the varieties. So it gives more resilience to extreme weather and pest outbreaks, because one plant might survive and one might be prone within one seed packet. Whereas F1 seeds are great for things like I mentioned sweet corn. They've been developed by plant breeders through natural selection via a plant breeder, and they have been selected maybe like sweet corn for shortening the season, so they grow very fast and you can get them in Wales to produce a crop. But other things, variation in the seed, things like carrots, can build up resistance. And if you then save your own seed, that natural variation becomes acclimatized to your local climate and soil, so you can build up your own resilience within your own saved seed. And I highly recommend that you attend a local seed swap. They're usually around the end of February, beginning of March, just when you're starting to think about sowing seeds. Now, obviously, in the current climate with COVID, that's difficult, but most local towns have sorted something out. In Llanidloes, we have a seed bank in the organic shop, so you can go in there, and during February and March, there will be a table out where it's easy for you to just walk in the side door and look for seeds. In Machynlleth, I believe they have envelopes somewhere. I can't remember where they are, but there's something there. And in Newtown, Cultivate shop has seeds for swapping. So, or swap with your neighbour. And often, if you don't have seeds yourself to swap, you can still attend a local seed swap. They all have donation tins, and you can just put a bit of money in the donation tin, which helps the whole system go round. So we're coming to the end of the presentation, and I want really to finish with one of the most important things you could be doing in your garden, and that's observation. It's often difficult as a gardener because as soon as you sit down in your garden, you see something that needs doing and you jump up again to deal with it. But we do need to spend time just sitting and observing what's going on. There's lots of scientific research out there that we can read and learn from, but we need to look at where has that scientific research actually happened and is it relevant for where I live? We can be doing trial and error ourselves, but we'll only remember what's going on if we actually observe and write down and record what we're seeing. And the best trial and error is to grow things as a comparison. Because if you grow one variety this year and it doesn't work out, you might grow it next year and it works really well. So grow several varieties and compare how they do in your soil and your climate and with different sowing times. Keep really, really good records. So keep records of combinations of what you're planting, what the weather was doing when you were sowing and harvesting, and how long things took to come to harvest. And above all, record what the wildlife is doing, and not just the fact that you saw a ladybird today, but what plant was that ladybird on? What was the ladybird eating? And learn about the interactions that are happening in your garden, because that is the most important thing in the battle against pests and disease, is understanding the holisticness of your garden. So that's the end of my PowerPoint. This is a little picture of part of my veg garden. Like I say, we're based just outside Llanidloes in Old Hall. We have 5 acres of productive land there where we're growing veg, fruit and flowers. We often have a couple of open days during the summer months, so if do look out for that in case things open up again this year. And do visit my website or Facebook page to get updates on open days and other courses. So we've got room, I'll just stop sharing, and then we've got some time for questions. I haven't been checking the chat, I couldn't see it.
Thank you so much for that, Emma, that was fascinating. So the first question, and there was some that just chipped in as you were going, was from Heather, and that was, so where do your onions go in with a 4-year rotation?
Well, like I say, it depends what else you're growing, and everyone's going to be quite different in what they want to grow. And it depends, are you growing just onions, or are you going to be growing leeks and garlic as well? Because if you're growing leeks and garlic, they all go in that bed together as well. But if you're just growing onions, onions go in the soil in March and they're out July, and so you can get something else in that rotation with your onions. So you need to think about what else you want to grow. So onions are quite good after potatoes, because potatoes are well fed and they're well dug and they're quite weed free by the end of the time you've dug up your potatoes, and you can put your onions in after your potatoes, and they take up any nutrient that is left behind after your potatoes. So that's one example. But like I say, it really does take a little bit of planning and quite a lot of practice to work out what it is that works for you.
Great. Another one was, can you overwinter your Brassicaceae?
Can you overwinter brassicas? Yes, you can. I'm trying to think if there's any examples that don't. Well, the summer cabbages, they rot when it starts getting wet and cold, but lots of the brassicas do overwinter. So at the moment, it's the main thing I'm cropping in the field. I'm still cropping kale. I've got purple sprouting, which will be starting to come into harvest soonish, later this month. I'm still cropping Brussels sprouts. I've got a few Swedes left in the ground. It's just the last ones. They're all quite small now. We've cropped most of them, but they're winter hardy. They'll stay in the ground. Turnips tend to be a summer crop. Summer cabbages are a summer crop and they won't overwinter. Does that answer your question? Any comments, Heather? Does that answer it for you? We'll presume yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next one is...
Yes, thanks.
Helen had a question about the Three Sisters and how it fits into the rotation.
Well, you're putting beans in. Now, beans, like I said, you don't have to rotate them because of soil disease. You're rotating them because of the benefit they give to other crops. So you don't have to worry about that. And you're growing sweet corn and squashes, which are both very hungry crops. So they need lots of food, but again, they don't have any soil-borne diseases. So they're not a major problem with the rotation. So none of those crops have soil-borne diseases. So it wouldn't be an issue as you move it round. But often what people do with that sort of intense companion planting is, you're growing more of a polyculture system where you're mixing things up. And it might be that you move those 3 crops together every year in rotation, put them in a separate place. But the 2 main families you need to be thinking about when you're thinking about rotation is the brassicas and the alliums. So if you get those 2 right, the rest of it will take care of itself.
Another question, thanks for that, is tansy scattered around a good deterrent?
Tansy is a good deterrent, but it's quite a big plant. It's very smelly, so it masks the smells of things. But you do have to be careful with your companion plants that they themselves don't become a thuggish weed. So it's about getting the balance with that. I personally prefer growing them in pots so I can move them about to where I want, or I have the herb bed near the veg bed, but not actually in the veg beds.
Okay.
What have we got here? First time gardening last year, and my broccoli all got destroyed by some sort of root maggot. How can I prevent that? You would need a collar around the root, so you can make them out of pieces of cardboard. So just spend your winter nights cutting circles, sort of this size, cut a slot into it, a hole in the middle. So you fold it up, cut the middle bit out, so you've got a circle in the middle and a slit, and then you just put it around the stem of your broccoli, and that stops the eggs being laid, because they lay the eggs in the soil just near the stem of the plant. And then the collar just stops them doing that. So you just put a collar around every plant. Does that help? And we've got, do you crop rotate in the polytunnel? And if so, what plants are best to do so? Right, crop rotation in the polytunnel is very difficult because you are mainly growing Solanaceae. And yes, you do need to rotate. Organically, if you're certified organic, you're allowed to do a 3-year rotation in the polytunnel, whereas it has to be a minimum of 4 years out in the field. And most organic growers are looking at 8 or 9 year rotation in the field. But it has to be a minimum of 3 in the polytunnel. So what I do is I have Solanaceae as one group. I have cucurbits as another group. And I have legumes as another group, which I mix with the flowers, because I grow lots of flowers for cropping. I grow my French beans. I grow overwintering peas and beans in the polytunnel. I've got them in there now, and they'll crop in May. And I grow French beans in there early and late. And the French beans grown in the polytunnel are much nicer and more tender than the ones grown outside in harsh Welsh weather, and I can get an early crop of French beans, so dwarf French beans in the polytunnel, and a late crop, so I have them in pots ready to go in when I start clearing some of the flowers out. But it is difficult because you're growing so many tomatoes, peppers, you might be wanting to grow aubergines, and they're all in the same family. I also grow some very early new potatoes in the polytunnel as well, a very early crop of potatoes, and again that's a Solanaceae. So it is quite hard getting your rotation correct in the polytunnel, and a lot of people are just growing tomatoes and not a lot else in their greenhouses. So you do have to be mindful of that. But most modern varieties of tomatoes are virus resistant, and one of the big problems with tomatoes historically was the virus. And so this is why you might have heard of people having to dig out all the soil from their greenhouse and replacing all the soil, and that was tomato virus. But a lot of the newer varieties are resistant to that. Okay, what have we got next? Can you tell us about some further edible flowers which can be companion plants? Okay, so edible flowers, I grow calendula, marigold. It smells strong, deters whitefly, aphids. I grow violas. They look beautiful. I don't know that they really deter any pests, but you know, they're good ground cover, and they look lovely. They look lovely growing, and they're lovely in a salad. Allium flowers you can put in salads and eat them. Borage. Borage is a big plant. Grow it outside, not in the polytunnel. You can eat those flowers. I can't think of any more off the top of my head now. Wrong season. I'll have to think about it in summer. Anyone else is welcome to chip in at that point. Do you recommend any books on garden planning? There's loads of books on gardening. One group of books that I really like for just basic, really straightforward information is the Dr. Hessian range, because they're really easy, quick reference on planting distances, expected yields, how long to cropping, and all of that sort of stuff. And they've got books on vegetables, they've got books on fruits and all sorts of flowers and shrubs and all of that. Very, very easy as a quick reference guide. The only downside of them is that they love chemicals. So as long as you ignore anything about pests and disease, I would recommend those books. And then for pests and disease, there's no quick fix. So, you know, don't turn to the chemicals. That the books, the Dr. Hessian books, all about which chemical to use. And I was very disappointed. Most of my books have come from secondhand shop, and you get them for £1 or you buy them online for a penny or whatever. But I went and bought a new one thinking they would have completely changed their attitude to pests and disease, but they totally hadn't. They were still talking about what chemicals they could use. But put that aside, they are really good reference books for understanding planting distances and how to grow things. So that's what I would recommend. And the Bob Flower Dew organic book is a very good, big, chunky sort of Bible on organic that you can have sitting on the coffee table and just dip in and out of. But the Dr. Hessian ones are ones that you can have in the field with you, quick reference. Oh, how do I plant that? What's the planting distance? How about no dig beds as an alternative to digging? Yeah, no dig beds are great, or minimum dig beds. There wasn't time in this lesson to even talk about that, but you can either start by digging and then work towards a minimum dig, so you're then mulching on top, or you can use green manures and lots of organic matter and mulch right from the beginning and start as no dig. So you could just start with turf on the ground, cover it with a load of cardboard to kill off the turf, build up the layers of organic matter and get a crop of potatoes in year 1. And then in the second year, you make a new bed for your potatoes, and the beds that had potatoes in last year, all the organic matter has rotted down and you've got a bed sitting there waiting for your next crop to go in. And you can start by developing your veg garden that way very easily, but you do need a lot of organic matter. And even when it's established, you need a lot of organic matter to keep mulching the beds regularly, because otherwise, especially in Wales, you get a lot of surface compaction from the heavy rain. So you need the organic matter to protect the soil. But that doesn't have to be muck or compost. It could be grass cuttings. So if you have a lawn, you can be cutting the grass and layering that on. And I use a lot of cardboard and grass cuttings to mulch my beds. Right, I'm going to have to speed up because the questions are coming faster than I'm answering them. Let's go back a bit. I missed a few.
I think that might be it, actually.
Oh, there's lots of things about nasturtiums. Oh, Charles Dowding books are great. Yes, and Charles Dowding online. He's got lots of little podcasts and things you can watch. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think that looks like it. And it is 7 o'clock. So that's amazing.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was absolutely brilliant. What a whirlwind of information. I've been recording it and I will put it, is it okay to put it on our Facebook page? Is that okay with you? So people can watch it again if they need to.
Yeah.
And yeah.
And we've got another one coming up, haven't we? When's the next one I'm doing?
Yeah, it's next Monday, same time, 5:30 next week. And that is going to be on things that you can sow sort of now-ish and into March, and a sort of beginner's guide to sowing. Okay, so I'll probably talk a bit more about soil preparation next week then. We can talk more about no dig systems and things then. Brilliant. Okay, well, nice to meet everyone. All these blank screens in front of me.
Thank you. Really good.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.